Best Loved Christmas Carols is a labor of love that was pursued to provide consumers of Christmas audio music, many of them repeat customers, a packaging alternative that not only satisfies their annual needs, but also appeals to their aesthetic inclinations for information and color. This volume about our favorite Christmas carols offers readers three special elements not normally found in other Christmas music products. 1. Well-researched information. 2. Wonderful illustrations. And 3. Beautiful music. Containing 25 of our most familiar carols, primarily from the United Kingdom and the United States, Best Loved Christmas Carols adds carol gems from Germany, France, and Austria to the mix. To familiarize the reader with how our favorite carols have achieved their time-honored status, the ensuing historical perspective traces the evolution of carols from the 14th to the 19th century. The first carol, according to legend, was sung by angels appearing to the shepherds of Bethlehem and declaring the birth of Christ and peace to men of good will. Derived from the French word carol, originally meaning a round dance and in later years a joyful religious song, the carol is the musical form by which Christmas is best known. The best modern definition of carol is probably that of Percy Dearmer, co-author of the Oxford Book of Carols, a compilation published in 1928. He described the carol as a song with a religious impulse that is simple, popular, and modern. A carol is folk-like in character. It is simple, has little pretense to it, has plain lyrics, and is a seasonal song. Today, most people think of carols as strictly Christmas songs, and it is estimated that 4,000 to 5,000 carols exist, most of them in the realm of the obscure. In fact, carols originally came from secular and pagan sources. The Greeks sang them in their plays, and the Romans used them during Saturnalia, one of their major festivals celebrating the winter solstice. They were quite popular and were sung for weddings, birthdays, and other festivities. Later, from the early 14th century until the outset of the Reformation, the carol was more aptly defined as a poem suitable for singing, made up of uniform stanzas, and provided with a burden, or an external refrain, repeated after each stanza. Very few vernacular carols were known prior to the 14th century due to several reasons: church interference in people's everyday affairs, the predominance of Latin usage, and obscurity. The 14th century witnessed a time of real troubles for the Christian church. Because of various abuses, the failure to observe religious vows, and the overt worldliness of the clergy, the church could no longer count on total allegiance from its members. In the sphere of music, this disengagement contributed to the composition of more secular music, the inspiration for which was found in a non-liturgical world. Secular music even invaded the ecclesiastical sphere, causing bitter complaints from members of the clergy, and Gregorian chant, the preferred music of the Christian church, began to be eclipsed by the new music. One might note that for centuries, music was given its greatest impetus by the Christian church. From the dawn of the church until the late medieval era, the history of music in the Western world was related to the liturgy. Music was made to become the servant of the Christian faith, and there is little evidence of the existence of non-liturgical or folk music before the 12th century, save for precious few extant examples of notated secular music, a point of fact not disputed by historians. Music was just another area where the church intruded upon the everyday affairs of its members. Resentment against this intrusion gave rise to the development of the democratic spirit. One way for people to register their displeasure was to write songs, many of them secular in nature, about love, drinking, parodies of church liturgical texts contorted to secular interpretations, the Crusades, and other subjects. By the 14th century, songs with vernacular lyrics, as opposed to church Latin, began to appear more frequently, further laying the groundwork for the developments of carols. With the dawning of the Renaissance, the rising of secular compositions continued unabated. Some of these compositions included carols. Though many carols were religious in content, they were essentially non-liturgical in nature. The origin of carols cannot be understood without recognizing their linkage to dancing. Like singing in the early church, dancing had been frowned upon by church authorities because they considered it immoral and associated with heathen worship. But long before the birth of Christianity, dancing and singing had existed together with religion. The Romans had religious dances, as did the Druids and other religious priests, and eventually these dances found their way into the Christian church. Dancing in the church, however, was outlawed after the occurrence of some scandals. The Council of Toledo in 589 and the Council of Avignon in 1209 separately banned dancing entirely from church worship, but dancing still accompanied the singing of songs and carols outside the church. Dancing while singing carols was even part of the outdoor nativity worship services led by St. Francis of Assisi, and in later centuries, performers danced and sang carols during the mystery plays. Some historians credit St. Francis of Assisi for introducing carols and dancing in 1223 at the first manger scene of record in Greccio, a small Italian village. The townspeople provided inspiration for St. Francis, who had taught God's love by leading a humble and exemplary life, including respect for creatures around him. St. Francis, in turn, encouraged his friars to build a living monument to the Babe of Bethlehem. They all believed Christmas should be celebrated as a natural reenactment of Christ's birth, a stark contrast to the rigid ceremonial religious rites performed amid so much pretentiousness and ornamentation inside the church. St. Francis requested and was granted special permission from the Pope to conduct midnight mass before the manger scene, which was erected in the open air, surrounded by an ox, an ass, sheep, and shepherds, and there he led the villagers and friars carrying torch lights in singing carols of the Nativity. The simple practice of reenacting the first Christmas slowly spread throughout all of Europe and England. The crèche scene would become the most cherished Christmas motif in France, and other countries of Europe and Western civilization would forever incorporate the manger theme as part of Christmas festivities. Along with this development, the singing of carols was flourishing. Anonymous singers, whose works constitute much of this collection, made up joyful songs that were part of an oral tradition long before they became part of the written record. During the latter part of the medieval period, from 1095 to 1453, most carols were still sung in Latin, although on an ever-decreasing scale, and after the year 1400, use of the vernacular language for carol compositions was more common. The medieval period was also a time when the democratic spirit continued to emerge, further aiding carol development. Carols were a reaction to the overemphasis of religion, and many of their tunes were sung to profane words. Common people everywhere in Europe wanted to loosen the grasp of the church on their everyday affairs. One way of expressing this thirst for more freedom was to dance, write, and sing songs in the vernacular tongue, without any of the restraints of church Latin. The composition of carols gave people a vent for ordinary expression. Although carol verses might sometimes be sung as a modified form of plain chant or plain song, referring to Gregorian chant, the medieval liturgical music of the Christian Church, the timeless, contemplative melodies of the Church were increasingly forsaken, and so began the era of modern music. Briefly stated, the carol was a modern means through which the ordinary man could express his feelings and temper religion's conservatism. As the feudal order continued to collapse in Europe and England during the 15th century, this modernization was largely accomplished. Another influence on the music and songs of the Middle Ages was the production of religious plays by guilds. Guilds could be favorably compared to today's large corporations from an organizational perspective, but they were very productive and against free trade. They also helped to finance churches and cathedrals and to prepare and stage the miracle and mystery plays that were exceedingly popular in Europe and England. Each guild took responsibility for a specific religious scene, providing, besides finances, the costumes and music for the production. Guilds were quite numerous. Venice had 58, Genoa 33, Florence 21, Cologne 26, and Paris 100, and they were well represented in every important town in England. The guild's production of religious plays was an impetus for the flowering of carols, particularly in England, although Latin usage would still be prominent in the 13th and early 14th centuries. Mystery plays were also an important source of carols. These plays, with their powerful music and literary material, helped ordinary people, many of whom were illiterate, learn the biblical stories. The theme of mystery plays was usually the life of Jesus Christ. Mortality plays involved allegorical representations of various virtues and vices. Miracle plays dealt with the saints and their lives. These plays were performed either on a fixed stage, where people went to see them, or in a procession in which a series of carts passed as a pageant with people looking on, much as floats in a parade today. The singing of carols became an integral part of the mystery plays. The audience was quite taken by carols because of their immense appeal, and on occasion, near riots erupted if these popular carols were not sung during a play's performance. In England especially, the carol was a byproduct of the mystery plays. The earliest surviving carols were often found in manuscripts relating biblical or legendary stories of the Nativity, the Virgin Mary, and the Crucifixion, the same stories depicted in the mystery plays. But there were also carols composed for the New Year, drinking and carousing, the commemoration of historical events, and other secular occasions. Today we know carols as essentially an English phenomenon, although France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the Czech Republic have made major contributions to carol development on the European continent. Poland, Austria, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Belgium have also added significantly to the repertoire. The contributions of the United States and other countries of the Western Hemisphere were not felt until the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. The theme of the carol was one of love, particularly in respect to the portrayal of a mother's tender instincts for her child. In the early days of the vernacular carol, this maternal picture was also symbolized by the rose, which represented perfection, and the Virgin Mary. The symbol of the Virgin Mary could be found in the rose windows of the great cathedrals such as Notre Dame or Chartres, where it was enshrined as masterpiece creations of the medieval era. About 500 medieval carol manuscripts have survived in England, some in several versions. More than 100 carols from the late 15th and 16th century have musical settings in simple melody or elaborate polyphonic settings. The English medieval carol, however, has no connection to the French Noel, despite the frequent reference to the word Noel as an exclamation of joy in a carol. The subject of English medieval carols could be anything. The French Noel, however, was strictly dedicated to Christmas carols. The word Noel was used by Geoffrey Chaucer in his late writings. The development of carols coincided with that of folk songs and polyphonic music, although the medieval carol settings, music composed or arranged to fit a text, were not derived from folk songs but from a simpler art form. The royal courts of Europe patronized music and musicians, and rulers sponsored choirs in their favorite churches. These choirs were quite attuned to polyphonic music and carols, as well as to secular and folk songs. The popularity of carols reached the point where they began to be printed in small books. The first collection of carols may have been printed in 1521 in England by Wynkyn de Worde, about whom nothing else is known. Some collections contained not only English carols, but also French Noels and German Christmas songs. Perhaps the finest collection of carols on the European continent in the 16th century was Piae Cantiones, meaning sacred songs. This 1582 songbook was in use for centuries in the Swedish realm, especially in Finland, which was then under Sweden's rule. It had 74 songs, less than half from sources in France, England, Germany, and Bohemia, now the Czech Republic. Piae Cantiones was compiled by a Finnish student, Theodoricus Petri Rutha, son of an aristocratic landowner, and contained both church and school songs dating from the period 1350 to 1450, including the carol tunes for Good King Wenceslas and Good Christian Men Rejoice. By the early 16th century, the carol had become a more refined form of composition. The richness and color of the Renaissance, plus the increasing secularity that characterized the literature and art of the age, had its influence on song and carol compositions. The poetic texture of carols was still apparent, but the scope of the carol had narrowed to the Advent and Christmas stories. In France, the carol, or Noel, came into greater vogue by the late 15th century and was composed specifically for the Christmas season. The first Noels supposedly came from songs of troubadours and from songs about St. Francis and his manger scene. In England, where the carol was composed for any season and might be secular or sacred, the emphasis was moving more towards Christmas themes. The carols, God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, and the first Noel were most likely composed in 16th century England, and from Germany would come the popular O Tannenbaum. The carol had become popular music, achieving a lofty status during that era, but it would be short-lived in its existing form. By the 16th century, the development of music no longer relied on the church for its greatest support, especially since music was used to challenge church repression. The influence of the church, moreover, had continued to wane seriously with respect to matters of the soul, not to mention songs and music. With the ushering in of the Age of Reformation, a whole new dynamic was reshaping the religious landscape of Christian Europe. The history of this change would also affect Christmas and its music. Martin Luther, a German monk and leader of the Reformation, was a lover of German music and folk songs, which may have been the finest in Europe. He felt that the church liturgy was too aristocratic, having become snobbish over the years, and too detached from the common people. This detachment was embodied in the church's practice of keeping the priest and the all-male choir who sang the Mass separated from the worshippers. Luther sought reforms in music, as he sought change in theology, ethics, ritual, and art. He loved polyphony and wanted music that would move people by fusing faith and song. Luther encouraged a greater participation by the congregation in singing, and he simplified the music from choir plain song to easy harmony, thus reducing the role and influence of the Mass. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the Reformation extended the range of choral music beyond the liturgy, and the informal group singing of songs was highly encouraged, leading to a greater familiarity with Christmas hymns. The founders of some Protestant sects did not like the idea of music being played at all in the church, however, and put limits on such activities. Their restrictions also led to a sharp reduction of boisterous observations of Christmas, although they welcomed joyful hymns as long as they adhered to scriptural meaning. In England, the extremes of the Reformation were being carried out by the Puritans, who reverted to the strictness of the Dark Ages. The Puritans strongly disliked music in churches and abolished it because they considered music an obstacle separating God from the worshipper. They advocated Blue Sundays and detested how Christmas was celebrated with merrymaking, dancing, and singing. They attributed many Christmas customs to pagan origins and demanded that Christmas be made a solemn day of atonement. In a 1644 decree from the Puritan Parliament, Christmas was declared a fast day as it fell on the last Wednesday of the month, which at that time was preserved and commemorated as the normal fast day. In 1647, Christmas was abolished entirely. The severity of these restrictions would influence the English people to believe that dancing before the altar was an embarrassment. Even with the onset of the Restoration and the ascension of Charles II to the throne of England in 1660, the Puritans would retain spiritual sway in England and America. Carols fell into disfavor during the Reformation because of their linkage to Catholic Rome and its quote-unquote superstitious practices, and because they had lost much of their vitality with the changing of the religious temper of the 16th century. In the English-speaking world, the Puritan extremes led to a 200-year hiatus of quality carol composition. The English Reformation, which had begun with the suppression of Christmas rites and celebration, and had influenced the further decline of Latin and lullaby carols, witnessed the rise of carefree secular carols, merrymaking, dancing, and drinking, only to have these excesses quickly halted by the strict Puritans. One of the positive aspects of this period was that all of the distress caused by the Puritan regime nurtured a deeper understanding and a more serious inward turning of the religious spirit of Christmas. In the countryside, the common folk of the 17th century kept the spirit of the carol alive despite the disapproval of the upper classes and the Protestant churches, inside of which the crucifixion was considered much more important than the nativity. Such severe religious emphasis also contributed to the decline of the carol. In America, the Puritan restrictions on Christmas affected the colonies of New England. The Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620 shunned any observance of Christmas Day and treated it as a normal working day. In 1659, a law passed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony forbade anyone from, quote-unquote, observing any such day as Christmas, or that person would be fined 5 shillings. The law remained on the books for 22 years. Even after Christmas was fully restored in England, its observance was still severely opposed in New England for many years. In other regions of North America and the colonies, however, Christmas was highly celebrated by pageantry and song. The Dutch in New Amsterdam, the French in Louisiana and Missouri, the Episcopalians in Virginia, and the Moravians in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and Winston-Salem, North Carolina, sang carols at Christmas time as they had in their native countries. America's southern colonies celebrated Christmas in aristocratic fashion. The English form of narrative ballad-like Christmas texts, which had little connection with the medieval carol, was hawked on English streets as broadside ballads cheaply printed and sung to popular tunes of the times. These ballads also appeared in the American colonies during the 18th century and could be found along with native folk hymns. Many of these early hymns were crude in form because the colonial composer was less exposed to sophisticated music and less educated, by and large, than the English composer. Like his Old World counterpart, though, his songs of the people were readily understood. Churchgoers in the American colonies in the late 17th to early 18th century were likely to sing the hymns of Isaac Watts, the English poet, since they were still closely allied to Puritanism, spurning most carols in favor of hymns. Watts wrote the poem Joy to the World, but it would be another 120 years before the American music teacher Lowell Mason would compose the music for Watts' lyrics. During the 18th century, the carol endured a precarious existence, yet a few important carols were composed. The lyrics of Hark the Herald Angels Sing were penned by Charles Wesley, an English clergyman and co-founder of Methodism. Adeste Videlis was composed around 1740 by an English Catholic exiled to Douai, France. However, compared to the beautiful carol gems of the 14th and 15th century England, such as There Is No Rose, the Boar's Head Carol, and Lully My Liking, the quality of the English carol in the 18th century paled. The quality of carol coming from the European continent was considerably better. The French Noel, such as Les Ans d'une Campagne, demonstrated the typical French flair for grace and charm. German carols manifested the religious and tender impulses of their composers. In churches, Protestants of all denominations dictated exclusive use of the vernacular for all divine services. The Lutherans especially relished the hymns of Martin Luther or the harmonization of German hymns by Bach. In England, Scotland, and the United States, prayers were spoken and hymns sung in the English language. Yet in the great cathedrals and churches of France, Spain, and Italy, and in the rough-hewn churches of Catholic parishes and colonies in the New World, the language of Latin dominated the Mass and other Catholic services. Gregorian chant was still employed, most often accompanied by instrumental music. The status of the carol, meanwhile, was stagnant in England. The effects of the Puritan era still could be felt by churchgoers in the early 19th century. In the countryside, though, common people maintained the oral traditions and kept some of the carols alive and vibrant. In 1822, Davies Gilbert of England compiled a carol collection titled Some Ancient Christmas Carols and had it published. The first of several important carol collections that would be published in 19th century England, Gilbert's compilation seemed to address the unfulfilled needs of the public for the resurrection of carols, especially Old English folk carols. 11 years later, another collection of English carols was compiled by William Sandys. The 1833 printing of Christmas carols, ancient and modern, helped to further revive interest in the English carol. Or was it really the other way around? The people's interest in carols may have spurred the printing of them. In the successive years of 1839 and 1840, the music for Joy to the World and Hark the Herald Angels Sing was composed, although the music for the latter, the work of Felix Mendelssohn, was intended as a musical celebration for the 400th anniversary of the invention of printing by Johann Gutenberg. In 1843, an important seasonal literary work by Charles Dickens had a large impact, especially when it was enacted on the theater stage. His classic, A Christmas Carol, won over a large audience that enjoyed the singing of carols and other aspects of Christmas celebration. This was the very same year the first Christmas card was created in England. With the presence of the German Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's consort, at Windsor Castle, German Christmas customs, such as setting up a Christmas tree, became more fashionable in English court life. When a picture of the tree at Windsor Castle was published in an 1848 edition of the London Illustrated News, the English populace eagerly emulated their trend-setting monarchs. Dickens' contemporary in the United States, Washington Irving loved English customs and traditions. With carol singing and celebrations of Christmas sweeping the English public, Irving, through his writings, encouraged his fellow Americans to partake of similar holiday festivities. This was no simple matter. America had disdained anything associated with the English since the end of the Revolutionary War. As they distanced themselves from English traditions, they were more apt to adopt Christmas customs brought to America by Dutch explorers from much earlier years. Even Washington Irving had prominently mentioned Sinterklaas, the venerable Dutch figure of St. Nicholas, 6 times in his The Knickerbocker History of New York. Irving's endorsement of English Christmas customs, the influence of Prince Albert and Queen Victoria in England and the United States, plus the popularity of A Christmas Carol, helped to develop the American Carol. American songwriters soon made significant contributions to the international carol repertoire. In 1849, Edmund H. Sears, a clergyman, wrote the poem "It Came Upon the Midnight Clear." James S. Pierpont wrote the words and music for Jingle Bells in 1857, the first and most famous of American secular carols. In the same year, John H. Hopkins composed "We Three Kings of Orient Are." Another poem made famous as a carol was "O Little Town of Bethlehem," written by the Reverend Phillips Brooks in 1868 for his Sunday school children in Philadelphia. These new carols of the mid-19th century helped to end the 200-year drought of quality English language carols. Elsewhere in the Christian world, original carols were composed between 1800 and 1850. On a cold Christmas Eve in 1818, a Catholic priest and the church organist of their small village church in Austria had to improvise for music when the church organ broke down. They proceeded to compose a quiet, dignified carol accompanied by guitar. Their effort produced one of the most stirring carols ever written, "Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht," Silent Night. In Catholic France, some church authorities regarded Cantique de Noël, O Holy Night, written in 1847, as a distasteful bit of music, and, as usual, the people thought otherwise. They loved it. A movement to sing carols inside Protestant churches emerged in England. English church elders were not enthusiastic about this development. Some of the carols, they felt, were less serious and more festive in nature, certainly not the type to be sung in church. Good King Wenceslas and the Holly and the Ivy were carols put into this category. From the middle to late 19th century, the English people had come to accept the popularity of carols both inside and outside their churches. They enjoyed the continual publication of Christmas carols, eagerly bringing them home to their families and friends. Important carol publications of this period were Collection of Ancient Christian Carols by Edmund Setting, a Catholic author who, along with John Mason Neale, was part of the Oxford movement that sought to revive Catholic liturgy. Songs of the Nativity by W. H. Husk. Christmas Carols New and Old by H. R. Bramley and Dr. John Stainer, and the 2 editions of Carols for Use in Church by R. R. Chopp. In the United States, another important carol hymn was published in 1885, Away in a Manger was actually an anonymous Christmas composition that for years had been erroneously attributed to Martin Luther, even being titled in his name as Luther's Cradle Hymn. The rightful composer of the music for this lovely carol was discovered to be James Murray, an American compiler of songbooks. When the 19th century came to a close, the carol had claimed its rightful place in the hearts of English-speaking people everywhere. The shadows from the Puritan clouds had finally receded. The carol was in a robust state of health, and the 20th century would witness its continued growth. The increased popularity of carols continued unabated well into the 20th century. Newer methods of transmitting music, beginning with the late 19th century introduction of the phonograph, and in later decades successive technology leaps to radio and television, helped to sustain the ever-increasing demand for Christmas carols and songs. Even popular singers from the United States and Europe, including famous personalities employed by the opera, were recording favorite carols. Their musical efforts were rewarded by an eager audience, and as the century moved along, marketers of the genre noticed the trend of ever-increasing sheet music and audio recording sales. To a large extent, the increase in sales of Christmas music was a direct result of sophisticated marketing techniques used to promote music, especially when popular singers recorded their own Christmas albums. To some extent, these techniques have helped to preserve the legacy of Christmas carols, even if the methods of promoting Christmas music collections have grown static through decades of heavy reliance on familiar marketing formulas. But the richness of the carol bounty in this volume has less to do with what has transpired in the modern era. Credit goes largely to the carol composers and collectors from the 14th to 19th centuries, many of them anonymous, who hailed from the countryside of England, Europe, and the United States. It was they who first preserved the contemporary and exciting carol style of music, either through the oral tradition or by publication. The fact that some of them had to overcome periods of religious repression and the often fickle objections of conservative church elders only adds more luster to their accomplishments. As each new Christmas season falls upon us, we might be mindful that our carol heritage was begun and sustained over the centuries by the inspired efforts of intrepid carol composers and collectors. Their contributions were especially significant, and we are forever in their debt. To them, we dedicate this volume, Best Love Christmas Carols. Next time, we'll be going over the first of the 25 best-loved Christmas carols, one in particular about the faithful. See you next time, everyone.